There is a writer by the name of Michael Garrett that I've been reading and rereading lately. And he is a spiritual practitioner and teacher and speaker and writer and a healer with the Native American Cherokee tradition. And I've been reading what he has to say about the word evolution, which is really interesting. You know, we think of evolution in kind of three ways. We think of it, you know, all of our metaphysical ancestors who have come down through the years, the stuff that we read, the great old books, the great old literature that we read about metaphysics that have come down to us. And they say that, you know, there's the physical evolution, and I think it was Ernest Holmes who said that there comes a time where the compulsory evolution ends, and the evolution of choice, the evolution of putting ourselves forward into a place of possibility and potential and choice, living in choice, begins to take over. And so we understand that to be the physical part of it. And we take a look at the fossil record that comes down to us through science and through all those people. We realize that when the universe exploded into its formation, that the compulsory evolution began to take over. And then we as metaphysicians know that within the Big Bang, within all of that, there was, of course, consciousness. Consciousness is always there. And Michael Garrett says there's that kind of evolution. And then there's the evolution that we think of in terms of the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of learning more about ourselves, learning more about the universe, learning more about the world, learning more about our place in it. And then he says there's another kind of evolution that is the journey forward. Once we begin to gather the wisdom and the knowledge, then we begin to move our journey forward. And Michael Garrett talks about the idea that he loves to think of it in terms of a rainbow bridge. And that's one of the reasons why I chose the song today, Over the Rainbow. Over the Rainbow. And what he means by that in his writing is he thinks about all the ancestors. You know, once we began to, as human beings, once we began to evolve physically and show up a great deal of who and what we are today, you know, when we showed up. And it's really interesting, the idea of when we showed up, because we know that we were not the first living beings here. In fact, we were probably a few hundred years, if not 1,000 years behind all kinds of other beings, animal beings and plant beings and insect beings and the four-legged and the eight-legged and the scaled and the feathered. And finally there came a time where we walked over that bridge. And he was talking about the fact that this all came together for him in the idea of consciousness, and the idea of all the beings coming together. And he writes of the rainbow. He said, a rainbow is not a rainbow without all of its colors, just as the sacred web of life cannot exist without every one of its strands of harmony and balance. And that's why he loves the rainbow so much, because when you look at those colors and you look at the arc of it, you realize that a rainbow isn't a rainbow until it's all together, all the pieces, the sacred web of life. And Michael Garrett talks about the fact that when in the native traditions, and this is true of all the most ancient of teachings, all the teachings that we come from, regardless of our ethnicity or our backgrounds or you know, our DNA or where our personal ancestors come from. Once upon a time, there was this idea of all the relations, and that all the relations are in connection with each other in this journey that we live on this earth, in this universe. And what got his attention about that was that when he was in college, he was taking business classes, because when he was in college back in the late 60s and early 70s, or sometime in the 70s, being a Native American, it was really important for the people at that time to take business classes, because they or to major in business courses, because they wanted people to come out of the situations they were in on the reservations and some of the poverty that was going on. But he didn't know if his heart was really there, and he would come back to the reservation. He lived in the Smoky Mountains on the East Coast, and he would come back to the reservation, and his own father was a healer. His own father was a medicine person, or a spiritual advisor, a spiritual leader in the tribe. And so he would come back, and his father would kind of turn him over to his grandfather and turn him over to other spiritual teachers. And they would go into the forest, and they were teaching him the medicinal plants that were in the forest that were there to help people deal with all kinds of challenges. And so he became just overwhelmed with how amazing and how beautiful this was. He'd be walking around, and they would point out to him the various plants and what they were used for, and they would harvest the stems, or harvest the flowers, or harvest the leaves, or dig up the roots, or maybe take the entire plant. They would remove it, and they would take it in, and they would come into communion with that plant. And the elders would talk to him about the medicinal purposes and the things that the plants would do to heal, how they helped people heal. And so he asked the elders, he said, how did we know this? How did we know this? How do we know this when we go into a forest and there's hundreds and thousands of these plants? How do we know how this all works? And the elders would say to him that when our ancestors crossed over through the physical evolution and began to walk upright and began to go into the forest and began to have their own challenges, then they looked out at the surroundings, and they looked at the other beings. And he said our ancestors were drawn to these plants and drawn to how they would help us. And he asked the question, well, how were they drawn to it? What language was spoken? What was known about that? And what the elders would say is that the language was the language of shape, the language of color, the language of texture, the language of smell. He said, what do you mean by that? And they would say, very often the shape of the leaves would be shaped like the part of the body that would be ailing. Or perhaps there was something in the bark that was a reminder of the color of the illness. Or there was something within the root that was a reminder of the color of what it was to get well. And we would look, our ancestors taught us to look at every single part of the plant and to try and imagine, what its uses would be, from its color, its shape, its smell, its texture, everything about that. And Michael Garrett poses this question, and this is such an interesting question metaphysically, that these plants, which came over the Rainbow Bridge sometimes long before our ancestors came over, hundreds of years, thousands of years, came into the world as we know it today, and began to develop their own consciousness to be of use, to be of service, to be part of the great web that he's talking about, which is the connection of everything, like the colors of the rainbow. And if we stop for a moment and we think that there was a plant, or there were plants that came over and developed a way to not only be medicinal in terms of their own consciousness, but a way of communicating that for a group of, now we say, people or other living beings who would come by them hundreds, thousands of years later, that they could come into communion with that. And Michael Garrett said this was an amazing insight to him, to see just how the world works together in terms of trying to foster and bring forth healing. In other words, we talk in metaphysics a lot of times about we are loved, and we are part of God, and God is part of us, and that God is pulling for us. God wants to help us. But Michael Garrett said this is a specific kind of idea. It's just one example of countless examples of how the universe is there to meet us where we are, and for us to meet it where it is in the forms of these plants. And then Michael Garrett goes on, and he said that the elders told him, he said, the plants also taught us how to be in relationship with them. And he said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, if you'll notice that sometimes the medicinal plants, the plants that they give us an incredible amount of medicine, they may be tender, small plants. They may be plants that those other beings who feast on plants may want to eat and devour. He said, and so they will come in a relationship with another plant that may be a plant that's poisonous, or a plant that's thorny, or a plant that's got a lot of thistles on it. And so it's a way of protecting. And sometimes plants will come into relationship with insects. They will attract certain insects. And so when other beings come and want to harm or use the plant or eat the plant, the insects will bother the other being, and the other being will go away. And he said, so when we go into the forest, we train our eyes for all of those relationships. And we make sure that we keep those relationships going. We don't eradicate a plant that doesn't seem medicinal to us just because it's poisonous or it's thorny. We leave it there because we know that there's a relationship. And what we know, and what Michael Garrett talks about, is that later on, when the Native Americans, and again, all of our ancestors began to farm, and the farming that went on here in North America long before Europeans came. And we think about those Native Americans who planted corn and beans and squash. And we know that in parts of the country where they were planting corn and beans and squash, they always planted them together, because the corn and the bean can be protected by the squash. Because the squash, its leaves and its vines, and the squash itself is very often covered with thorns and prickly to help keep the predators of the beans and the corn away. And the elder said, this is something that we learned from the beings of the plants. And Michael Garrett talks about the relationship of the Native Americans, and again, all of our ancestors, to all the animals and to the birds and to the insects, that we were drawn to, speaking the same language. The language that we could put into a larger context of intuition. And what Michael Garrett is talking about here is he's talking about the idea that it is with our relations, it is with the strands of the web of life, it is with all the colors that we know that Spirit is there to assist us in working out whatever challenges we have. And Michael Garrett talks about, in our time, in the 21st century, there's two lessons here. Number one, that we should not think of nature as the other, but think of it as a partner, which is something that we're probably all thinking about in terms of some of the issues that we see our planet dealing with. But the idea that we are literally surrounded with those who can come into relationship with us, who can help us move forward into our solutions. Michael Garrett says this: to understand the power of relations, we are required to live in harmony and balance with all living beings in the circle of wisdom. Excuse me. That come to us when we let go and draw upon the sacred healing, the sacred medicine of all of our relations. These wisdoms are a gift revealed to us from our openness to receive their revelations. You know, sometimes I think that our oneness excuse me, the oneness practice that we get into is in order to share love, in order to share compassion, in order to do the right things morally and ethically. And I think that that's right. But what we're coming to understand by looking back at some of our oldest and most ancient of traditions and teachings is that this is also our way forward. You know, I was listening to I was listening to the meditation this morning before the service started, and Andy Turin was talking about the idea of 2020 being a challenging year, and I can attest to that. It has been a very challenging year. And I think that sometimes in our challenges, we have this tendency to begin to withdraw, very much like we have withdrawn from nature to some extent. We look at the other, we see the other, we pull ourselves away, and we want to draw upon ourselves alone, like, say, the Lone Ranger or something. And what these teachings are telling us is that we are always smarter than me, that the time to sort out all these issues that we're facing are from the cultures and the wisdoms and the ideas that come through each of us in a very interesting and independent way. To draw upon all of the wisdoms that are within the circle of healing, within the circle of wisdom. To be able to truly walk the rainbow bridge. You know, it's interesting in our current culture that the idea of the rainbow is associated with the LGBTQ community, which is a community that has had a hard time getting foothold in the larger community, a hard time being accepted, a hard time to be able to share their wisdoms about things and to bring forward their medicine and their healing. And so the idea of the rainbow, after reading Michael Garrett's work, is the idea of seeing it as the bridge, as this way of us all coming together, that we all have a very special sacred consciousness to bring forward once we open up to spirit. That the rainbow flags and the rainbow images represent not just healing and not just compassion, although they do that, but the idea of building communities that work. What is it that we can bring forward? What is it that we can bring to the party, so to speak, to work out whatever issues we're working out? The other part of this that Michael Garrett is trying to share with us in his work is this idea of the elders going into the forest and simply looking at what's around, looking at the possibility, opening up to the common language. The plants, you know, which is the center of what I'm trying to share today, using it in the broader context with the plants. It wasn't just that we needed to understand them. They found a way to understand us. Just think for a moment about what it took to form a level of communication between the individuals of the plant world and the individuals of the human world. Plants are not built the way we are in terms of being able to talk, in terms of being able to readily move. And so they had to understand us as much as we understood them. Ernest Holmes and all of our teachers talk about this universe. Everything around us is filled with this intelligence, with this consciousness. I mean, wow. The plants had to figure out how to communicate with us as much as we had to figure out how to communicate with them. And in both cases, if you think about it, in consciousness, it was that each had to observe the other, which is a place of presence, which is a place of, let me spend time with you, let me love you, let me understand you, let me be present, let me look at your way of protection, your way of working with your world, so that I can learn more about my world. And the synchronicity of the fact that when our ancestors showed up, when our ancestors through physical evolution crossed that bridge, what was waiting for them was answers in consciousness. Wow. That's amazing to me. All of the metaphysical laws that we study, the law of cause and effect, the law of attraction, the law of synchronicity. And it shows us this incredible intelligence that has been at work through all three stages of evolution. And we talk about, very often as human beings, we talk about about each other. We say, well, this person or this teaching is walking with me, walking the journey with me. And what Michael Garrett says is the plants are walking the journey. The birds are walking the journey. The insects are walking the journey. The other mammals are walking the journey. We're all walking the journey together. I was reading where when we think about the migration of Europeans and people from other places to the United States, but the migration that took place when the Native American ancestors came here many more thousands of years before that. And we take a look at here in California where we live, and the salmon runs in these rivers and creeks were essential to the Native Americans who first came here and those immigrants who came here. And what we know, what has come down through the traditions is, how did they know about the salmon runs? How did they know about that? They came into a region, they stopped, they looked, they listened, they felt, they opened up. And they let the other predators who were here before them show them the way, show them the rivers, show them the creeks, show them the abundance. In terms of solving our problems, in terms of wanting to make 2021 better than 2020, it's about coming together and creating a better year. It's about coming together and allowing ourselves to be shown the good medicine, shown the good healing, shown the way to interact and to find the medicinal pieces that we so desperately need. The challenges that we face over time change. But as Ernest Holmes would say, the law is the law is the law is the law, which means the way we go about healing always stays the same. To be aware, to be awake, to be present, to be open, to be loving, to be caring, and to be able to walk the journey with others. I want to put a bow on this with Ernest Holmes, who says, before spirit can reveal its secrets, an outlet must be created through our own receptive mentalities to accommodate these revelations. Thus, all wisdom that has come forth has been given through those who have deeply penetrated the secrets of nature, the essence of beauty, truth, and wisdom. He says, thus, all wisdom that has come forth has been given through those who have deeply penetrated the secrets of nature, the essence of beauty, truth, and wisdom. And I know for us that in order to create our healings from whatever challenges we have before us, that the essence of beauty, truth, and wisdom are already here to lead it and direct us. I am so grateful for this, and I'm so grateful and humbled that you're with me here today. All right. So we are now going to move into